Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Shape the System. I'm your host, Vincent Turner. Today, joined by Anika Molesworth. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Vincent.
It's going to be great fun. And let's get straight in. The label here is climate-wise agriculture, but I want to dive into the problem space that you're working on and in fact talking a lot about.
Sure. Well, yeah, as the name suggests, it's about farming and farmers who are facing the big challenge of climate change.
Right.
So farmers obviously work very closely with the natural world, and so they're on the front line of these changing environmental conditions.
Mm-hmm. And how is it that you're playing in this space? Are you going to? I mean, the farmers obviously are being affected by it. Is your role in what you're doing with climate-wise agriculture, trying to help these farmers in how they approach the world, how they change their own, or how to deal with the effects of? Like, what's the space here?
It's really sharing the story of farming as it relates to climate change. So I'm not just talking to the agricultural community or to scientists working in, farming, but also the wider community, because, we all eat foods that the farmers produce. We all wear clothes from the fibers that the farmers produce. So everyone is very much tied up in agriculture and the food and farming system. And so what I'm trying to do with climate-wise agriculture and the different farming groups that I'm working with and the storytelling I'm doing is to firstly educate people on how climate change is impacting food production and fiber production and farmers' lives and livelihoods. Mm-hmm. I'm also trying to engage them in the story, actually help them connect to farmers, to feel, the impacts of the drought, to feel, that respect for food and land. And then finally, I'm trying to empower people to feel like they can do something about this. Right. Because too often when we read about climate change or environmental destruction, it seems overwhelming. It's doom-laden, or it's, terribly complex and academic the way it's presented. Right. And I want people to know that they are part of this system and that they can do something to help change it in a positive way. Okay,
and let's start with that change, because I think, and in watching some of your talks earlier, there's certainly an aspect of helping people to understand changes that they might make, and I think this isn't specifically just related to changes they might make in their own behaviour of recycling and choose green energy and the like, but it's actually changes in the way that they relate to the food supply and an understanding of farming and the decisions they make in that context. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you're very right. It's about, changing mindsets, changing, people's hearts and feelings towards farmers and food and, the wider community aspects of this topic, and then how that flows on to changed behaviour.
Right. And give me let's have some practical examples here in terms of what a customer, or customer is probably the wrong word, but a person might do differently in their relationship to their food and to farming in general.
Sure. Well, in Australia, we have a large urban population, and that's, similar to most countries around the world, where there are more people in the cities than there are in rural areas who are involved in the farming community. In Australia, less than 1% of the population are, farmers, yet we provide 93% of the food consumed here. I find it quite interesting when I go to the city and I give a presentation. There's a lot of interest there from, the urban people, but they feel very disconnected, detached from farmers, from the food system. Right. I recently went to Sydney and I gave a talk, and someone apologized for the rain. They said, very sorry, you've made the trip to Sydney and it's pouring with rain today. And I said, God, I'm absolutely loving seeing the rain. We've been in drought for so many years. And it sort of just highlights how important it is that we're telling the story of what's actually happening in the vast expanses of Australia, and saying, the drought is actually an incredibly serious event for us that's actually directly impacting the food that you're receiving in the cities.
Right.
And so helping to, illuminate that for people so they can actually understand that, the rain in the city is not such a bad thing. It's actually quite good for the environment, for food production, gets them to think about these wider topics of the interactions between climate and food and society and all of this.
Sure. And then from an action perspective, so, obviously awareness first, but then like someone, I think was the term you just used, urban dwellers, was that?
Yeah.
Urban people, which is awesome. I've never heard that term. Urban people, like with this information, what types of things might they be doing differently to play a role in supporting the change that supports the farmers who are trying to change? I know that's kind of convoluted, but
Sure. Well, maybe they might consider, purchasing more local produce, Australian produce, whether that's, a friend's birthday is coming up and they'll then think, oh, well, I'm going to actually buy a beautiful Australian merino wool jumper for my friend instead of, another item of clothing. Or I'm going to, buy some local honey from from someone who's got some hives down the road or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's getting people to realize, how incredible the Australian farming story is, how we produce such amazing quality and quantity of food here. All the while, we're in the driest inhabited continent on Earth. We have this incredibly naturally variable climate system. It is a tough gig, Australian farming, but Australian farmers do it incredibly well. And that's a story we should be celebrating as all of Australians.
Sure. And then coming back to the farmers a bit on this, so there's a big part of trying to shine a light on the conditions at the moment for farmers, but there's also a part of what you're doing, which is helping farmers to rethink the way that they're engaging with the land, specifically in farming, but in other places as well. Can we talk a little bit about that? Probably first in the nature of farming.
Sure. Well, Australian farmers, I think we manage between 60 and 70% of Australia's land mass.
Right.
So we're managing a very important and large part of the country. So we need to be doing it the best way that we possibly can. And to do it in the best way we possibly can, it means that we need to, have the latest, science information, how to look after our soils in the best way possible, the water resources the best way possible, our vegetation, our biodiversity. How can we improve what we're producing? How can we create new and exciting markets that consumers want to spend their money on? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to be done on farms. And I think this is why I love working with farmers so much, in that they are incredibly innovative and hardworking and forward-thinking. Every day on the farm, there's another challenge thrown at you. They're varied. They come quickly. But farmers, generally, they don't sit around and point fingers and blame it on someone else or, wait for someone else to fix the problem. You actually have to get out there and do it yourself. You actually have to.
I was going to say, it's a get on with it kind of attitude.
Put the gate back on the fence that's fallen down. You actually have to sort the sheep. We've got limited labor resources. We've got limited financial resources. So you've got to be quite innovative in how and resourceful in how you manage the property and how you earn a livelihood from it.
Right. And you talked a bit about a drought, and I think in some of your works it talks about specifically this millennium drought. Sorry, not millennial drought. I don't think we have that. I'm curious in terms of kind of the major issues that the farmer is encountering today. Like obviously water is one of them. What are some of the other 2 or 3 big challenges that they're facing in terms of how they farm or the impact of the farming they're doing?
Well, I guess the climate conditions are becoming increasingly challenging. I mean, we only have to think back of news headlines the last 6 months of this year. And, we've had bushfires, we've had floods, we've still got droughts,
right.
We've got changes in disease outbreaks. Australia is an incredibly, diverse country in that we've got all these different geographic regions. So we have tropical fruits in far northern Queensland. We've got arid zone goat farmers in the middle of Australia. We've got vineyards and, Mediterranean crops and things like this in southern Australia. So There's no one thing that's impacting all farmers in Australia or all regions. It's incredibly diverse.
Right.
But I think, apart from the climate challenges of the, increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events that we're experiencing and having to cope with, there's also the challenge of this disconnection between urban and rural communities, that people more and more are further removed from the food system and the people who are producing that food. And we've got to bring them closer, because as it becomes increasingly challenging in the farming community to grow food, to manage, these changing conditions, we actually need the injection of new ideas, new concepts, new lines of thinking from people outside of agriculture, so we can continually adapt and evolve as a sector.
Right. And just drilling into that a little bit, we tend to think, and I'm included in this, as farmers as being kind of monoline in their role, which is to, produce food, whether that's a grain or or an animal. And I certainly even haven't thought about them in terms of their stewardship for the land. But I think part of your thinking here is taking it even beyond that if you were to manage, to your point, 60% of the land mass of Australia, what else would you be doing with that land? And I think you've just touched on the idea that getting more people, urban people, out into the land would be one form. I think there's a nod to energy in there as well. What's the broader role that farmers play beyond simply food production, and how are you thinking about that and also taking that forward?
Yeah, so much. So I guess firstly, productive farming businesses support rural communities. We're buying things in these small country towns. We're supporting them. We're sending our kids to their schools. So, farmers are very much involved in the rural community vibrancy going forward. We're also managing feral animals. I mean, in Australia, we do have big problems with feral cats, foxes, pigs, goats, camels, horses, you name
it.
Yes.
New camels was on that list for some reason. So.
And so farmers actually...
Where are the camels, by the way? Can we pause there for a second? Where are the camels?
The camels are in Central Australia and Western Australia. That's where in the arid regions. So not on my farm, thankfully. So they're not crashing through our fences. So I do actually feel a bit sorry for the farmers who have to be fixing fences after camels have walked through them.
Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine.
So that's incredibly important, because if we look at things like, feral cats and foxes, the amount of damage they do to small Australian marsupials, our native wildlife is absolutely devastating. And so to actually manage the feral species, animals as well as plants, I mean, we have a lot of invasive, pest plant species too. And so farmers do play a very important role in looking after those things, or managing those things, I should say. They also play a particularly important role in citizen science projects. Places like, the Australian Museum and, universities, they often run these surveys of, monitoring frog species or other endangered species. And farmers, like my family, we go out to the dam in the evening and we record the sounds of frogs. And that information is then sent to the Australian Museum, who then can identify what frog species, so they can have a better idea of how to, population numbers, of how to manage them, of, research that needs to be done on these species.
Yeah. I can ask an odd question maybe, but what's the motivation for a farmer to, in your case, to record the sounds of frogs? That's fascinating.
Because a healthy biosystem, a healthy natural ecosystem is the foundation for our farming business. If you've degraded the biodiversity, if you've degraded the soil, if you've degraded the water resources, they are the building blocks to your farm business. So you're not going to be able to have a productive farming business if you damage the natural resources that you have there.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think we tend to but people living in cities don't tend to think about the interaction of I mean, you might watch it on the David Attenborough special once and go, oh, cool, that makes sense. But in terms of having an innate understanding that, the frogs in a lot of respects are the indicators of whether a wetland is healthy, I think, and they're kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you take that metaphor.
Yep.
Is a fascinating idea. Okay, so we've got playing a role in biodiversity and understanding and and citizen science, I think you call it, which I love that term.
Just going back to that, I think if you're after a get quick rich scheme, you're not going to go into farming. It's not just about earning an income from the farm. I mean, These are our homes. These are these incredible landscapes that we love, that we spend every day, working to protect and conserve and to, regenerate. And I think, that's what drives farmers to record those frog species or to remove those weeds, because it's their home. They do feel this great affinity to the natural environment, and they do want to look after it.
That's fascinating you say that, because I think I'm not sure that people living in cities have that appreciation for how farmers at a collective level feel about the land that they're on. I think a lot of the time we, tend to see a demonized view of, modern agriculture has a massive impact on the environment, and you sort of hear the pockets of farmers who are doing good work, but not thinking collectively that, it's kind of their own nest, they don't want to be mucking that up.
Yeah, and, most of Australian farms are family-owned businesses, and that's global as well. Most of them are family-owned, and many of them are passed down in generations, over generations. They're intergenerational businesses and homes. And so people have a real respect for the land, for, the farming culture and community. And they have these long-term perspectives, because if you degrade the land now, you're not going to be able to pass that on to your kids.
Right.
So you need to actually look after it and manage it in the best way possible, so you have, this beautiful legacy that you can pass on to the next generation.
Yeah. And just going into that purely from a climate perspective, I know that's kind of always the elephant in the room in these considerations. And so I'm trying to understand the changing environment, in terms of climate generally is definitely a global issue, but as the farmer, you're having to look in your own backyard and try to make changes in your own backyard that can either offset or reduce the impact of that global issue. What level of kind of control and, ability is there for a farm or a farmer to offset what is happening at a larger level?
Well, it's quite variable. It will depend on, the farming business, their location, their access to resources. So I do a fair bit of work in Southeast Asia, and farmers there have very low adaptive capacity to climate change because they have limited financial resources. They have very small land sizes. They have limited access to labor. They have limited access to new information and technologies. So when they are hit by a flood or an insect outbreak or a family illness, they tumble further into hardship, which is very difficult for them to then get out of. And in a lot of these places, I mean, they're struggling to feed their communities today, let alone, in 10, 20, 50 years when the climate projections are that it's going to be a lot more difficult.
Right.
Yeah, so for instance, on my family's farm, we're located in far western New South Wales in a naturally hot and dry bioregion. It's an absolutely beautiful part of the country. I love it. But the arid regions are incredibly vulnerable to climate change because they are already so difficult to manage. They are marginal, low productive farming systems. So when we experience a drought, when we experience, higher temperatures during summer, that hits us so much harder because we have such little wiggle room to work with.
Yeah.
So we see those impacts on our property, very, very clearly.
And in that exact example, I remember watching something where you were saying that the temperature on the ground is like 75 degrees or something.
Yeah, that's right. So, something that we've done is we've established conservation reserves around some of the rare and threatened species that we've found on our property. And the tree that we've set up, a conservation reserve, is called a Eucalyptus gillii, a curly leaf mallee, which is, this gorgeous silver-leafed gum. And they've been dated to around 1,000 years old in our valley.
Wow.
And they're not regenerating. We're not seeing any new trees. And so we set up these conservation reserves to remove any grazing pressure, still no new trees coming through.
Yeah.
We tested the seeds to see, were they still viable? Yep, absolutely. They were growing in controlled environments, fine. So nothing wrong with the seeds. And so we set up these temperature stations and we were recording, 70 degrees open ground summer temperatures. So how do you expect anything to grow in those temperatures?
Yeah. And like to the question, I guess, of how much of the lever can you control? I mean, there's only so much you can do when temperatures are 70 degrees.
Yeah.
Are you having some success in trying to offset or limit or adapt to some of those really extreme changes that you're seeing, maybe using your farm as the example or more broadly?
Well, absolutely. We're trying to. The problem with climate change, it's happening at such a pace and such a magnitude. Farmers are struggling to keep up with it, to adapt quickly enough. So on our family property, we run African sheep and goats, and they are arguably two of the most hardy livestock species anywhere on the planet. And yet we used to run 1,000, in a good season. Now I think we've probably got 40 left on the property. So we've pretty much completely destocked because it is too hot during the summer temperatures. I mean, we've had weeks over 40 degrees. We've had such little rainfall. Last year, we only got 60 mil of rainfall.
In the whole year?
In the whole year. So the ground is pretty much bare. There's not enough feed for the livestock. Right. And so the question that I grapple with is, well, if it's too hot and dry to run African sheep and goats, what's next? Like, we have literally come to the end of the line in terms of our adaptive abilities to farm this region.
Right. Yeah.
And unfortunately, in these remote, arid parts of the country, there's very little research, development, extension occurring because we are low productive farming systems. We are far away. We're difficult to manage, these farming environments. So farmers really are being left to their own devices to figure it out themselves. And that's risky.
Yeah. And so a big part of then what you're doing with Climate-Wise then is to try and coordinate and some of that activity and bring common practices or common understanding or learnings across different farms and across different kind of facilities within farms. Is that how that's working?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of land out here, but not many people. So I actually feel a responsibility to try and share what I'm seeing is occurring out here in the great expanses of the country, to actually share what I'm seeing on my family farm. And so I do that, writing, recording videos, doing podcasts like this, and trying to share my observations. I've also, had, 13 years at university studying agriculture, science and climate change and the environment. So I've got a good scientific understanding of, what I'm actually seeing and what that actually means.
Yeah.
And so, what I'm trying to do with Climate-Wise agriculture and with these different farming groups and with the communication work that I'm doing is try to explain, okay, this is what we're seeing on the farm. This is why this is occurring. And this is why we need to be doing something about it.
Got it. And so in terms of your sort of day-to-day, there's obviously some aspects of this that a farmer or even a consumer, can take action on. But a big part of this, I think, is trying to get people to fully connect with the impact that the macro climate change piece is having. Is that a part of this?
Yeah, exactly. So understanding the big picture is important, I think, to understand the interrelations, the interconnections between it all, because the food that you serve on your plate at the end of the day is related to the droughts that we're happening out here in rural Australia. I mean,
and the frogs.
Yeah. So climate change impacts the availability of food. I mean, how much food we can produce. It impacts the cost of food, how much you'll spend in a supermarket. It also impacts the nutritional value of food. So we need to actually, educate people on those aspects. And if people feel like, okay, climate change is actually directly impacting me because that cyclone made that bunch of bananas $15 a kilogram, and they're brown, bruised bananas that I don't want to eat.
I love how we're still getting mileage out of Banana Gate.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good, clear example. Yeah, and so if we can help connect those dots of, what's happening in the wider picture, then people can go, oh, okay, well, climate change is then driven by the carbon footprint. How am I contributing, to this carbon footprint? What do I need to do about it?
And like from where you're standing on the farm, I don't know, are you physically on the farm today?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. From where you're standing on the farm, what do you think of in that context of that problem, the biggest, I guess, opportunities and the biggest levers? Like if you say to people, you got to do these 58 things, they're like, well, I don't even know where to start. If you say, look, do these 2 or 3, then they can start somewhere. What are those 2 or 3 from your perspective?
Well, look, the 3 things that I say people can do is, use your consumer influence, your political influence, and your social influence. So in regards to using your consumer influence, I mean, every day we're spending money and, putting our money somewhere, whether that's, in banks, in superannuation companies, in energy companies, in the food we buy. So actually speaking to your banks and superannuation and finding out where are they investing your money and does that align with your values? Mm. Actually talking with your energy company, looking at, the products you're buying on the supermarket shelf. What is the carbon footprint of, where you're putting your money?
Right.
In regards to using your political influence, I mean, that is engaging with your elected representatives, whether that's, local council, state, federal members, and saying that this is an issue that matters to me. As one of your constituents, I want you to be doing more on climate change action.
Right. And
then lastly, using your social influence, that's, talking to the radio, that's writing a letter to the editor, that's flooding the news feeds with what is going on, and more importantly, what can be done about it.
Sure, understood. And then you growing up on the farm, actually you didn't grow up on the farm, your family bought the farm recently, or talk me through that?
Yeah, so we bought the farm in the year 2000, so I was 12 years old.
Where were you before that?
In Melbourne.
Just in Melbourne, being an urban people?
Yes, being an urban person. Yeah, so we bought the farm in the year 2000 and absolutely, we all fell in love with it. And I don't know if you've been out to Broken Hill, but it's this, wild landscape, very, very natural and untouched. And you can walk for hours and not see another person. And, you're very close with the nature here.
Yeah. But let's come back to the moment when you were 12 years old where everyone got in the car and went for a drive and went, do we like this place? We're thinking of leaving everything and buying I'm just curious as to how that moment happened in the first instance.
Yeah, it's a bit of a funny story. We were on our way to do a camping trip to the Flinders Ranges. We got to Broken Hill. The heavens opened and all the roads got cut. The roads got flooded with water. So we got stuck in Broken Hill for a fortnight, fell in love with the town, ended up buying a farm. And my parents, who have backgrounds in, botany, geology, anthropology, I mean, they love the natural world. They had dreamed of buying a parcel of land.
Right.
Yeah, and so we ended up being out here.
I think there's a certain irony that the rain got you to stop in Broken Hill. Just to place that geographically for people. So you were in Melbourne, which is kind of the capital of a state capital of Victoria. Flinders Ranges is sort of a few hours northwest of there. Is that right? And then place that all for us.
So Flinders Ranges is in eastern South Australia. Broken Hill is 30 kilometres from the South Australian border, but it actually sits in New South Wales. So if you were in Melbourne, you would drive 12 hours directly north on a very straight road and you would run into Broken Hill.
I love that. It's funny because in Australia, 12 hours is like, oh, yeah, you do it in a day. And I'm like, oh, that's the entire length of the UK, just to put some scale in into the mix here. And then so from there, from you being on the farm from age 12 to where you are now, how was the evolution for you to think I've got to play a larger role in this, and climate-wise agriculture is how I'm going to do that?
So the year 2000, when my parents purchased the farm, was the start of the decade-long millennium drought. And so our introduction to agriculture was, quite a steep learning curve, in that the first 10 years we had little to no rainfall. Right. And so it became very quickly apparent to us just how interconnected, farmers are to the land, to the natural environment, and to climate, how that impacts the local community. So, sure. For instance, when the rain doesn't fall, less vegetation grows, livestock are sold at reduced weights, and crop yields are not achieved. Less money in the farmer's pocket means they search for off-farm employment. Shops and schools in rural towns close. And then, in the cities, food prices go up, food quality goes down. And I think it was living through the millennium drought, on this place that we had fallen in love with, that we had started, having these visions of what we were going to do out here, right, and see it deteriorate during the drought, to, have these wild dust storms that turn day to night, to see the impact it was having on the mental health of people in our community. Sure. Really opened my eyes. And so I did more and more reading about, climate change and, the projections. I was dreaming of taking on the family farm, of, running sheep out here. And the more I was reading about climate change and what it meant, the more and more concern I had. And it was not only concern for what the science was telling me, it was concern that we didn't have leaders actually taking this seriously, of actually, trying to shift the trajectory in the way that the science was saying we needed to do so. And so I then was, becoming more vocal about it, actually, taking film of what's happening on the farm, of writing articles about, this is right, my concern as a next generation food producer. And that's, when Climate-Wise Agriculture as a platform I established, and then, met farmers from around the country who were experiencing similar concerns and wanting to do something, and Farmers for Climate Action was born out of that. So yes, it's been a bit of an evolution.
Yeah, and you talked about 12, 13 years in study, but in the sciences, not in like communications. Like a lot of what you're doing now is trying to connect the stories and actually bring those stories on both sides of the table a bit more together within each domain, and also across those two domains, being the farmer and the people in the cities. Yeah. How have you landed? Like communications part of it is like such a central part of what you're doing. How you've almost landed as a kind of a quasi spokesperson for this issue within Australia in a big part. How did you land that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, actually, I think, because I'm naturally a very introverted person. I'm very quiet. I like hanging out with the sheep in the paddock by myself. So actually, traveling to a capital city and standing on stage and talking to 2,000 people does not come naturally to me. But that's the role I now find myself in. And I do it because I have that huge sense of responsibility that if I'm not talking for this land, if I'm not explaining the science that I know, then who's going to do that? Who's actually going to, step up and be the leader if I keep on saying, someone has to, but I won't do it myself. And so, over the years I've, been working on, well, how do I tell the story? How do I connect people to the science? How do I help them feel what I feel, which is, I feel it to my heart, the trouble of climate change, the concern, the want to do something, the frustration in the lack of leadership, in not doing enough. Right. So, yes, it's been quite a process in learning how to tell a narrative. Yeah. And to help people join the dots. Yeah. And with this, I just wanted to sort of reflect on the whole COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in. Sure. Because there's sort of been a lot of comparison of, these large global challenges that we face. And there's climate change. And this year and, latter half of last year, the world has been facing COVID-19. Sure. And from our leaders, like we've been told for so long that we can't change radically. We can't change quickly or globally. It's too difficult. It's too costly. And COVID-19 highlights how amazing a good narrative can be.
Right.
When we are told clearly what the problem is, what's causing the problem, what we need to do and how to do it, almost overnight, people from around the world change their mindsets, change their behaviors.
Yeah, very.
And that's what we need to do with these environmental problems, with food security, with climate change, is to tell a really good narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And then because you're playing a very, I think, quite a specific role in a broader issue like climate and even environmental degradation more broadly, is, as you said earlier, is a multifaceted issue. There's a lot of interdependency. In what you're doing, there's obviously a whole bunch of adjacencies. Who else is doing amazing work in and around this issue, even if it's not specifically related to agriculture, that you sort of draw, inspiration from?
Yeah, there's a lot of terrific groups and individuals doing work, both the research side of work, the engagement and the extension side of work, the storytelling. Farmers for Climate Action is a fantastic national Australian group that we've got here. And as I touched on briefly before, it established about 5 years ago with a group of 30 farmers who met in the Blue Mountains, and we sat down and had this conversation that we didn't feel like our political representatives were actually representing our views on climate change. We were feeling, lost, and, we were seeing these changes happening on our farms, but unsure how to adapt or reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And so we got together, and from small beginnings, huge things grew. And now we have over 5,000 farmer members from around the country who are wanting to do something about climate change. And what we're doing is, engaging them with policymakers. So, farmers are pushing conservative rural MPs to say, we actually need to do more about climate change because it's impacting our lives and our livelihoods. We're working with the best available science. We're working with the experts to understand these changes in our environment, of how can we produce food and fiber well into the future, under these projections. And we're also working with the media in sharing better stories, because too often in the media we were seeing, this narrative that farmers were conservative, that they didn't believe in climate change. And honestly, I think it's rubbish. I can look out the kitchen window and see a dust storm. I'm not denying the conditions haven't changed. And so this is, okay, well, how do we tell a better story and get it into the mainstream press so people actually understand what's happening?
Yeah, that's a fascinating perspective. I think we want to hear more about that group at some point as well. Now, I think I know the answer to this question that I tend to ask around this point in the interview as well, which is typically ask, how do people stay centered in everything that needs to be done? I mean, there's a huge amount of passion in everything you've been saying today. So, you've got to be able to turn off and switch off. I'm sure that happy place for you is the farm itself. So let me know if I'm wrong on that firstly.
No, it's the farm.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah,
you're right.
Absolutely the farm. So what I thought might be interesting is I'd love for you to just paint a picture of what it's like on the farm, like your day on, not even your day on the farm, just when you go into the farm, not to do anything specific, but to just be present in that environment. Describe that to me.
It's a very beautiful, peaceful place. So we have sapphire blue skies, which are generally cloudless, which is not necessarily a good thing around here. We have ruby red sands. We have these low shrub environments with salt bush of wattles and mulga trees. We have ephemeral creeks, so they only flow after rainfall, and they're lined with these ancient river red gum giants. We also have the foothills of the Barrier Ranges crossing through our property, and these are rocky hills and gorgeous valleys that you can walk in for hours, and you come across emu nests full of, giant emerald emu eggs, and you see wild goats on the hills who, look down at you and, run away when the sheepdog starts barking. It's an incredible environment.
That sounds magical.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, they think, the arid lands of Australia, it's deserted, it's lifeless, there's nothing to see there, I'm not going to visit. When if you come out here and you stand still and with patience, you see the most incredible wildlife, these giant wedge-tail eagles soaring above you. You see these incredible little, bearded dragons scuttering amongst the bushes. And you meet these incredible people who are living out here in these environments. So I absolutely love it.
I have a real passion for it. Oh, it's lovely. It's actually really a calming, soothing way to sort of round out today. Anika, it was wonderful, magical talking to you. I think there's so much more actually I'd love to have talked about, but I want to put some links into the post so people can sort of go and read more, because it would be, we'd be cutting it short to try and cover it now. But I thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Vincent, and for sharing this story.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.